Okay. Hi, Rich.
Hey, how you doing, Dorothy? Just admitting some people in here, so.
Okay. You do realize we're competing with President Zelensky.
This meeting is being recorded, so I
Oh,
know
okay.
someone had requested it, so I am recording it, so.
Okay, I'll behave.
Oh, hello, everybody.
Hey, Stephen, how are you?
Hi.
Oh, good. How you been?
Good, doing well.
Yeah, it's just starting up now. Huh? No, stay. I can hear them and not.
Yeah, I just want to go read my book.
No, I can't do it.
Hey, Steve.
Hey, Tom, how are you?
Very good. Good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you. How are things down in Florida?
Wow, it got nippy today. It's like about 55 degrees right now.
That'd be short sleeve weather up here right now.
Well, I got on my t-shirt, Yankee t-shirt on.
Okay, good.
See that,
Yeah,
Tom?
Ah,
Tom Vasty's asleep over there.
I'm right here.
You see the shirt?
I'm trying to up the volume.
Hey, Rich.
Santa hat on.
Hey, how you doing, Tom?
Hey, Barbara.
Hi, how are you?
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
It was still, people still coming in, so we'll just, admitting people. Oh, good crowd today.
great.
The meeting, just so you know, is being recorded, so just to make everybody aware of that, it will be posted on our Facebook page. I know some people have requested that.
We can use it. Don't take any chances. Don't take any chances, just in case. Yeah. Come on, guys. Very soon, it's gonna be a stress. You hear it up there? I don't know, I just go.
Okay. So I guess we could start it up. Stephen, I'll pass authority to you to present.
Hey, thanks.
Okay.
Another thing also too, if everybody can just mute their microphones, that would be great so we can hear Stephen clearly. Of course, everybody knows Stephen DeVillo, the number of books that he's written. This one is Battle of White Plains. He has written other books, one about the Bowery, another about the history of the Bronx River. He is definitely a well-versed author in different topics, you know, not Bronx history, but a lot of other things too. So let me just admit this other person. Stephen, if I could also ask you to, if possible, during the meeting, if somebody else does come in, to just admit them. It's up on the upper right-hand portion of your screen. So
Oh, okay.
that'd be great if you could do that. I mean, you know, maybe keep your screen like a little bit minimized off to the right, so that then you could admit anybody who does come in. So we do allow, obviously, people to come in if they, you know, lose connection or if they do arrive late. So definitely. So, and again, also too, if everybody can mute themselves, that would be great. And then I'll turn over control. Or hey, oh, Jason sent out, yes, admit. Okay. Oh, people are still filtering in. This is good. So I think we'll give it a go. I hope everybody's doing well today. The holidays are upon us. This should be a good talk. It's a little bit out tonight, so it just as well that we're here online on Zoom. when everybody could get definitely access to it. Person here, admit. So, okay. I think I'm going to start passing over control to you.
Okay, I'll start to shared screen. Hopefully this will work.
Yeah. Let me see.
Oh, no, you got to host disabled participant. You got to enable participant screen sharing or make me a co-host, whatever.
Okay, I'll make. I think I right click, so I'm going to make you a host.
Okay, let's try this again.
Make host. Yes. Yes. You are the host now.
Okay, eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Ah, this one. Okay.
Okay. So you're the host.
Okay, there we go. God,
Excellent.
I'm getting better at this as time goes on.
Good.
Yes, let me admit somebody. Okay.
I'm just,
So, thank you, everybody. I'm really thrilled to,
I can see it this way. No, just the way you were.
Please mute everybody.
yeah, silent movie here, you know. Anyway, I'm really pleased to be speaking to you all because a great deal of this book came out of things I've learned at the East Bronx History Forum, and there's a number of people who are mentioned in the acknowledgements for very good reason. I'll get to that later. Essentially, Battle of White Plains, Washington versus Howe and Westchester. Now, by Westchester, this includes the Bronx. The Bronx did not exist in 1776. It was the southern end of Westchester. And it was a series of events that took place in the present-day Bronx that had a great deal to do with shaping the outcome and the course of the battle. Which, by the way, a bit of good news. You may have read in your history books this was a defeat for Washington. I don't think so. When you see what I present, you will tend not to think this was any kind of a British victory. But that being the case, let's move on very quickly.
Why that meeting was so significant.
Oops, wait a minute.
What we're seeing out in the room.
Okay, hang on. Oh, there we go. Okay, I just had to click the right button.
According to our colleagues who are in the House chamber.
Okay. Now, before I start, I just want to very quickly share something with you that I saw last August. I was out at the Old Stone House in Brooklyn. If you've never been there, I strongly recommend it. Where the last act of the Battle of Brooklyn took place on 27th of August, 1776. And they, as part of a memorial of this event, they had this field of flags out behind the Old Stone House. And it's 256 pairs of flags.
Someone has a radio on.
One American and one Maryland. And this commemorates the 256 men of the Maryland Regiment.
Who's not listening to you, Steve? Somebody's listening to a TV or radio, and we're all
me.
listening in.
The host can mute everybody and then unmute themselves to talk. So one of the hosts has to mute everyone.
Okay, how do I do that? Well, I think we're quiet now.
everybody. Okay, let's get this cleared up. It's, I don't know if you have the ability to do that, Stephen. Maybe if you just, I don't know if you right click on yourself or, so I think maybe that's how you do it. I'm not too certain. But if everybody can mute themselves, I'd appreciate that.
Let's mute my audio. I think we'll have to rely on everybody muting themselves.
Yes.
Okay. Well, anyway, Battle of Brooklyn and the sacrifice of the Marylanders. It's where our story begins. The campaign of 1776, the first big action was the Battle of Brooklyn on the 27th of August. And it was a major disaster for the Americans. They were kicked out of Long Island. I won't go into the full story, but it's a very famous picture of the action. It's one of the closing events of the day, where the Americans are desperately trying to retreat across Gowanus Creek and the Gowanus Marshes. And this spot is for real. It's a very accurate painting. Where this spot is today is the foot of Sackett Street in Brooklyn, right about midway on the Gowanus Canal. And you see everybody jumping into the water. Well, you wouldn't want to do that today. But enough of that, we'll move on. In September, the British invade Manhattan. They force Washington to yield New York City, that then was at the tip of Manhattan Island, and retreat up to the highlands up around Harlem. And there's a very, very jolly British lieutenant. Great picture, by the way. I took this a couple of years ago. And for the next 7 years, New York City would be an occupied city, and it was a very jolly place indeed for officers, not so much for the men or the
I have the
refugees
high
or
privilege and the distinct honor of presenting to you His Excellency Volodymyr Zelensky, President of the Ukraine.
oh, somebody's listening to.
Can we please to everyone to close up their microphones, please? Thank you.
Anyway, okay, let me. Okay, here we go. This the computer's running a little slow today, so bear with me. Washington retreats up the stem of Manhattan up to the high ground around 155th Street.
All these for our
Where the-
brave people. Thanks.
We're getting all kinds of strange sounds here. Up around the Polo Grounds, and they were far from a totally
We are
defeated army.
Americans. In all
16th,
states, cities, and communities. All those who value freedom and justice.
Whoever's
Cheers.
watching
Yeah.
Freedom and
Yes,
Justice,
as
put
we
yourself on
Ukrainians
mute, please.
Build our cities.
There are
In
5
each
people
and
who are
every
still
family.
not muted.
I hope my words of respect and
Judy
gratitude
Strobel, please. mute.
resonate in each
If
American
you're not
heart.
Is there a way
interested,
for the
leave
host
the
to
meeting.
mute it?
Madam,
well,
my
actually,
The
yeah,
host
yeah,
has the power to mute
thank
everybody.
you
Then he,
for
yeah,
your
I just can't
efforts
do it all at
in helping
once.
Ukraine.
Yes, you can.
Madam,
I've hosted Zoom meetings. The host can mute
you
everybody.
bravely visited
Okay, then what do I
Ukraine during
click
the
on?
full-fledged war. Thank you very much. Great honor. Thank you.
Ah, there we go. Okay, I think we're quiet now. Oh, 16th of September, the Americans retreated up Manhattan Island to the high ground. They're still far from defeated army, very aggressive. And 16th of September, the Battle of Harlem Heights takes place. It was a meeting engagement, blossomed into what almost became a full-grown battle, and it was a defeat for the British. This all played out approximately where the campus of Barnard College is today, around 116th Street. Point is, this made the British general very, very cautious about approaching Americans who were dug in on high ground. British commander was William Howe. William Howe, a year before, had been the ground commander at the Battle of Bunker Hill. I mean, that means he wasn't watching it from across the river. He was there on the ground as everybody in his entourage was shot down that day. And he was even getting splattered by blood and other viscera from people. And this had an effect on his thinking. And he would never take a cavalier attitude towards Americans who were dug in. And this reinforced his caution. That once again, there's supposed to be a defeated army running away. As they marched up Broadway, the Americans lashed back at them very effectively. Oops, okay, I'm going backwards. Okay, now we got it. So, with the Americans bottled up at the northern end of Manhattan, this is the British dilemma. Opportunity once again to destroy the American army. They had this opportunity in Brooklyn and they blew it. Washington got across the East River. They had this opportunity again on Manhattan Island. They could have crossed the island, cut off the Americans in the lower end of Manhattan Island. Again, they blew it. They hesitated. Americans slipped past them, got away. So here's one more opportunity to end the revolution in the summer of 1776. Trick is how to do it. Landing on the Hudson River was not practicable, but there were only 2 crossings off of Manhattan Island to the mainland, the King's Bridge and the Farmers Bridge. If the British could get to these two bridges on the other side of the Harlem River and close off these avenues of escape and then catch the Americans in a pincer attack, one coming from the north, the other coming up from the south, it could be game over for American independence. How to do it? Landings on the Hudson River were not practicable for a lot of reasons I won't go into. So instead, the British opted to sail up the East River, or I still insist this is Long Island Sound. They had to bypass a lot of very marshy terrain on the southern end of what today is the Bronx. They found a good landing beach just in the lee of Frog's Neck, and they marched up. There's a nice road that led through West Farms, about 7 miles to Kingsbridge. Easy day's march. Just looked like the war was going to be over, except they got to Westchester Creek, and there was a causeway there with riflemen waiting for them. They took up the planks of the bridge, and the British were stalled. There was no good option other than this bridge and causeway over Westchester Creek. So what does the British general do? He sits there for 6 days, trying to make up his mind what to do next. Other opportunity is lost. Next step, he sails a little further up Sound to Pell's Point, about where Orchard Beach is today. And again, you had the Battle of Pell's Point. This is a mural that's in the Bronx County Courthouse. It's sort of accurate if you look past the Davy Crockett figures that, the coonskin hat caps. It's a little silly, but this was painted in the 1930s. So, what did they know back then? But nevertheless, it depicted the action very well. It was basically an action where they ran up against a brigade of New Englanders, tough fishermen from Marblehead, guys who weren't going to panic and run away. Instead, they fought a delaying action from Stonewall to Stonewall and forced the British to waste an entire afternoon clearing this road. While this is going on, 6 miles away, Washington's army has gotten out of Manhattan and is on the road up to central Westchester. Again, another opportunity has been blown. There was a third action, which very little remembered today, the skirmish at Heathcote Hill. And it's rather interesting because this involved two of the most renowned units in the war. The British were a organization known as the Queen's Rangers, and they were led by the legendary Robert Rogers. If you remember French and Indian War, he was a big hero in the French and Indian War, who organized the American Rangers, as they were called, and literally wrote the book on small unit actions. To this day, his rules for ranging that he wrote in 1757 is reprinted in the U.S. Army Rangers Handbook as a guide to how you conduct warfare. But years have been very, very tough on Rogers, who by then he was an alcoholic, not quite up to what he used to be. And an attack force out of White Plains was able to surprise them one evening and almost carried the day. And this will be about the end of Rogers's career too. But meanwhile, Washington is struggling up through Westchester. And where's he going? What's the strategy here? Why is he heading to White Plains of all places? Most history books don't give you any clue as to why White Plains. I mean, okay, it was a crossroads town. It was the county seat, but none of this was terribly important in and of themselves at this point in the war. The real reason, very, very mundane, flour and pork. There was a great deal of supplies that had been stashed in White Plains that had come in from Connecticut. Now remember, this has been a very bad summer for the Americans. They've been retreating from Brooklyn, Manhattan, out of Manhattan. And all along the way, they've been losing supplies hand over fist. By October 1776, Washington literally could not afford to lose another cup of flour. So what he had to do, his goal was to get into the Hudson Highlands, very rugged terrain, a natural fortress. He could sit out the winter there, but to keep his army together, he had to feed him. So instead, he had to jog a bit eastwards, take over the town of White Plains, secure these supplies, and put them on wagons and get them going north to the new depot up at Fishkill. Now, these were ox-drawn carts. You know, you didn't have deuce and a half trucks or any kind of modern transport back then. They'd move like at best, maybe an average of 2 miles an hour. This is not very swift transport. So he would need time. Need time to load up the stuff, get it on the wagons, get the wagons organized, and get them moving up and across the Croton River. So while this is going on, he had to hold his position somehow in White Plains, deny this road to the British until it was good time enough to retreat the rest of his army up to Fishkill. Occupying White Plains, Washington first moved out into a house that's still standing today. It was the house of Jacob and Abigail Smith Purdy. And you can visit this today. It's the headquarters of the White Plains Historical Society. A very, very nice place. He didn't stay there very long. Today, this house is on top of a hill. Back then, it was down at the bottom of the hill, and literally right on what would become the front lines once the British showed up. So Washington was persuaded to move his headquarters. His second in command showed up a few days later in White Plains. A guy by the name of Charles Lee, extremely controversial guy. Well, you could have an entire weekend conference about this guy, and believe me, I've been to such weekend conferences. Suffice to say, and this is one of the more flattering portraits of the fellow, second in command of the Continental Army, a guy with immense combat experience. He had been an officer in the British Army. He'd been a soldier of fortune in Europe. He'd been a general in the Polish Army. His experience was all over the place. He knew the craft of war. He was not a native-born American. In fact, he only showed up in America in 1773. And it's probably mainly for that reason that he was not considered for the top command, and instead went to Washington, who was a native-born Virginian. And Lee always seems to have resented this. He thought he was, knew much more than this amateur George Washington. And Washington, too, understood that Lee had a lot of experience. And when Lee spoke, Washington, at this point in the war anyway, things would change as time went on. At this point, Washington would listen when Lee offered his advice, which was pretty much all the time. He was one of these people who always had an alternative plan for you. So Lee told him, don't sit here on the front line. You're going to get shot. Move your headquarters. I got this real nice house about 1.5 miles back on the front line to be perfectly secure. You could park your staff there and do all your work and not get overrun by the British. And this was the house of Ann Fisher Miller that today is in North White Plains. And this too is still standing. It almost wasn't standing up until about 2019. It was literally starting to fall apart. And there was a talk of demolishing it or burning it down or sadly neglected. But Westchester County came through with restoration funds. And today it's all nicely fixed up, just like you see it here. And occasionally this is open for various events as well. Washington and Lee both made this house their headquarters. And it must have been very interesting because these are like totally divergent personalities. Washington was always the consummate Virginia gentleman. Lee was not. I'll just leave it at that and just we'll continue on. So anyway, finally, Howe stirs himself. Here's the Washington's headed for White Plains. Okay, I better get the army moving. Maybe we could get a battle at White Plains. Now, opportunity to cut off the army or intercept it on the way up there has been long gone, and Howe knows this. But still, honor dictated that he chase after them, pursue them, try to get a battle, try to get some kind of advantage out of the situation. So he gives Washington about a week to dig in at White Plains. Finally, on the 25th of October, he moves out of New Rochelle and moves his main army up what today is Mamaroneck Avenue in White Plains. White Plains then was not a major city. It was just pretty much those little buildings there dotting the roadway. Moves the main part of his army up Mamaroneck Road, and then he splits his army. He moves a division mainly of Hessians and one brigade of British down what today is the Fenimore Road. towards what would be the Hartsdale train station. The idea was that they would swing up the York Road, and this would speed up the whole march a lot more, using 2 roads rather than 1. Problem. Runs into a whole brigade of Americans who are dug in along the, excuse me, the Fenimore Road. Brigade under a colonel by the name of Joseph Spencer, who I believe is a distant relative of Princess Diana, but that's neither here nor there. That's a little genealogical trivia for you. Spencer's men are lined up behind very high stone walls on either side of the Fenimore Road. Again, it's those damn stone walls that are always bedeviling the British. And this picture, I believe, is one of the original stone walls from 1776. I can't prove it, but it's standing there today along the Fenimore Road. They offer battle. Fortunately, they're coming up against the Hessians. These were the guys, they were the auxiliaries of the British Army. Not correct to say that they were mercenaries. The individual soldiers were not. They were conscripts, they had no choice in the matter. They were part of regiments that were literally rented out by the various princes, landgraves, counts. Germany was divided into about 300 different political divisions in those days. And all of them had very big budgets, you know, very, very lavish lifestyle. The British agents, knowing they didn't have enough soldiers to put down the rebellion, they went to Germany, went to some of these various people. It's like, dude, could you rent us a regiment or 2? We'll cut a deal. And again, the soldiers had no choice in the matter. You go do as you were told. You sent where you were sent. But they were tough soldiers. They were very deeply, very brutally trained. And of course, they had those totally cool brass hats, which you see these modern day reenactors wearing. Scary guys when you meet them in combat. So after the fighting started on Fenimore Road, eventually the militia, which was most of the American force, broke and ran for it, ran for the Bronx River. So meanwhile, the main force is advancing to White Plains, and what do they see? They've got like a whole line of Americans that are dug in on the high ground. Oh, not again, the high ground. What is these guys with the hills and stuff, you know, with trenches and breastworks and other things. This exactly what General Howe did not want to see. So very high, very rugged hills. Purdy Hill, if you ever climb that, you'll know what I mean. Hatfield Hill is even worse. And so General Howe decides he's going to try to, this is his favorite maneuver, make an end run around one of the flanks. So he sends a force eastwards towards Merritt Hill. Horton's Pond is today Silver Lake, if you're familiar with the area. But unfortunately, the Americans are dug in on Merritt Hill too. And fire a couple rounds from the cannon on the British side. Okay, this is not going to work out. And there's a monument to this day commemorating the action on Merritt Hill. And so there's still one of them is trying to get away. The eastern end of Washington's line mainly dug in on what was called Hatfield Hill. It's on the opposite side of Silver Lake. And this is an old postcard, but it still pretty much hasn't changed to this day. It's an extremely rugged, glacially bouldered hill. It could really take twice about attacking. So what else? What other options do we have here? So advancing to White Plains at the last minute. Now, this is one of these things that really turned the whole story. Once again, Charles Lee had a word with George Washington. George is dug in on Purdy Hill and the hills to the east. Lee points out Chatterton Hill, what today is known as Battle Hill in White Plains. And says, you know, you ought to fortify this place too, because this will secure your left flank and it'll make things difficult for the British. So at the last minute, Washington is sending troops, which very hard to spare any troops, but he managed to send some and occupy Chatterton Hill. And this would pose a problem for the British as they advanced to White Plains. And this is pretty much what it looked like in 1776. This particular picture was drawn in about 1860. You know, you see the railroad tracks, but very little change from what it had been in the Revolutionary War. You see the Bronx River is flowing there just past the fence. And that road that's snaking up the middle, that's present-day Battle Avenue, but which then was the Dobbs Ferry Road. It directly connected White Plains with the Hudson River town of Dobbs Ferry. So a very important road to secure in and of itself. And interesting thing about Chatterton Hill, it's one of these very deceptive hills that when you're standing at the bottom, it's about 180 feet high from the banks of the Bronx River. And you stand there, yeah, it doesn't look like much. You know, I climbed that in about 5 minutes, and about 3 minutes later, you're out of breath and your legs are aching and your ankles are revolting. Tougher hill than it looks. But it was a good place for the Americans to dig in. And it's a pretty accurate picture of the Americans moving to occupy Chatterton Hill. This is one of the very, very few units in the American Army that actually had uniforms in those days. They were known as the Delaware Regiment or the Delaware Blues, or sometimes the Blue Hens Chickens. And with one of two guns that were dispatched by Washington to help defend the hill. Guns which may or may not have been accompanied by this bright young college kid by the name of Alex Hamilton. You may have heard of this guy somewhere. I think they made a musical out of him a few years ago. This is debated, but I'm not going to get into that debate. It's another one of those weekend conference controversies. But a very accurate depiction showing Chatterton Hill. You see the Bronx River flowing over on the left, and that rise over on the far left in the background is known as Fisher Hill. And this would play a role in the action as well. There's one problem with Chatterton Hill if you want to fortify it. And of course, everybody knows sooner or later I'm going to get into geology. Well, geology is an important part of the story. And this particular outcrop, I could talk for an hour about the stories this outcrop has to tell. But none of that's important. What is important is that the rocky spine of this hill runs along its eastern side, which is fine, except if you're facing the British coming into White Plains, the eastern side of Chatterton Hill is exactly where you want to dig entrenchments. Only you can't dig entrenchments. You go down half an inch and you're striking rock. What the Americans had to do was there was a cornfield in the middle of the hill, and they tore up the corn stalks and they kind of piled them up and wove them together, make them look like some kind of a fortification. Not very strong, but still give you some psychological comfort. The British are moving in, and now Howe realizes that he's thinking of attacking straight ahead, right up Purdy Hill, right up the York Road, what today is Broadway. Except you got these guys on Chatterton Hill, right off your left flank. Now, one thing you never do in warfare, and particularly never in the 18th century, was launch an attack forward and leaving a strong force of men in your rear or on your flank. And that's what Howe had to consider. He had no idea how many men were up there on Chatterton Hill, what kind of quality they were. No eyes in the sky back then. But he did know if that was a serious force and needs to be attacked straight to the north, and these guys came down from Chatterton Hill to the west and started shooting his men in the back, well, that's how you lose battles back then, or today for that matter. So he's got to move a couple of brigades to assault Chatterton Hill before he can do anything else. Now, one brigade chased the retreating Americans across the Bronx River, and they actually went in, they forded the river, but none of their compatriots would follow them. The other Hessians stopped right on the riverbank. I'll tell you why in a moment. And that's why the Bronx River was quite literally rising to the occasion and doing its patriotic part to help preserve the revolution. Now, this is a picture that was taken 2 years ago when Hurricane Ida came through, and you probably all remember that. Or really, if you drive the Parkway with any regularity, this is not a strange scene by any means. Bronx River is known as a flashy river. Get any kind of heavy precipitation, it rises very quickly, goes to flood stage very quickly. And that's what it was doing in 1776. Not quite as dramatic as Hurricane Ida. This, by the way, is a scene that was taken right in my own neighborhood the day after the storm. But still, nevertheless, the waters at the ford at the foot of Chatterton Hill could have been knee deep in October. It was more than chest high, it was even neck high, depending on how tall you were. And bear in mind, this is the end of October. Not a good time for taking a dip in the Bronx River. Trust me, I've done it. I don't recommend it. Not that time of year. So the main force of British and Hessians hesitated. They didn't follow Colonel Rawls' brigade across because they think, oh, maybe we could like make a bridge or something. There's got to be a better way of doing this. Well, there wasn't a better way of doing it, unfortunately. So how positions British and Hessian artillery on Fisher Hill? That's the one you saw in the painting. And they opened up an hour-long bombardment of Chatterton Hill. And this would be followed up by main force. They were going to have to ford the river no matter what. So that's what they did. And Colonel Rawle, in the meantime, he's the guy at the Brown Arrow. He's on this hill in what today is Hartsdale. And he's looking on, seeing like everybody, they're literally attacking up the steepest part of Chatterton Hill. And he's like, this is stupid, you know. So he took his forces on a wide flank to the west, where the slope is a lot easier. Still pretty breathless climb. I mean, I've climbed this hill from every direction, so I can speak from experience, but a much more gentle approach than trying to climb straight up, you know, from the ford. And this is what worked. What the Americans advised, and they would have to retreat. Not a pell-mell panic. It was a very orderly withdrawal, but nevertheless, they were going to have to yield Chatterton Hill. This is the type of gun that really did the killing that day. It's not so much a cannon, it was a howitzer. Has a very comically short barrel. That's because it was designed to fire exploding shells. Exploding shells in 1776 were basically what we'd think of as a cartoon bomb, you know, be like a hollow iron sphere with a fuse picking up, and this would be lit by the flash of the cannon. And hopefully, if you cut the fuse right, if you timed everything just so, it would explode over the enemy's heads and do some very, very gruesome damage, as indeed they did that day on Chatterton Hill. This is an example. This is in Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, so you can go visit the armory and say hello to this gun anytime you like. So as I mentioned, Colonel Rawle is coming in from the west, and he's a guy, a lot of strange things have been told up. If you recognize the name, this is the guy who would come to grief at the Battle of Trenton 6 weeks later. And it was all said, now he was a playboy, he was a drunk, he was a boozer, he was hung over that day, and that's why the Hessians lost. And none of these is true. He was a very, very serious, very consummate soldier, a very good commander. And of course, he was leading Hessians. These guys are drilled like machines, and they would do exactly what they were told, no questions asked. So it was going to be Rawls' attack is going to make all the difference that day. After the artillery caused a lot of casualties and softened up the Americans, and after the British launched their main assault up the steepest part of the hill and thrown back twice, and it was only the third time that they timed it in conjunction with Rawls' attack from the west, and they started to succeed. This is a painting of Rawls' men advancing up that western slope of Chatterton Hill through wheat fields that, for one reason or another, parts of it were ablaze. Whether on purpose or accidentally, nobody knows. But you notice in this painting, they're holding up what looks like their clutch purses. Well, those are cartridge boxes. And a Hessian soldier would carry as many as 60 paper rounds of gunpowder in one of these things. You did not want a chance of spark getting in there and blowing your hip off. So that's why they're walking in this rather strange way, holding up their disco purses. And once they get to the top, they're met by two of probably the best regiments in Washington's army. I mentioned the Delaware Blues. These were the guys in the painting. And they were there with what remained of the Maryland regiment who had saved the day at the Battle of Brooklyn. And they gave the Hessians a very, very tough fight and very, very grudging withdrawal. Even with a bit of was almost a friendly fire incident. I had mentioned that the Delaware Blues were about the only unit in Washington's army that had full uniforms. Well, you see the smoke coming out of these guns firing the gunpowder, and things are getting very hazy. And at one point, the Hessians crested the hill and they saw the Delaware Blues. They thought they were Hessians. So the officers ordered a ceasefire, ceasefire, whatever it sounds like in German. And here's the strange thing. The Delaware Blues heard that, and they saw that the Hessians were ceasing fire. And well, they were great sportsmen. They turned around and said, no, 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 we're Americans, we're Americans. And shooting started again. This is the way things were done in the 18th century. It seems a little strange to us. But this is one of the best pictures I've ever taken. You've heard the expression, the fog of war. There's even a documentary made by that name. In the 18th century, this was not just a turn of phrase. It was very literally the reality. After one or two volleys of black powder, very inefficient explosive, you got these huge clouds of white smoke all over the place. And pretty soon you see the picture, you can barely see your hand in front of your face. This added to the confusion of both the Hessians, the British, and the Americans. But nevertheless, the Americans were able to withdraw off Chatterton Hill without going into a panic. They withdrew with their flags intact and their units intact. They marched down what today is Battle Avenue, right past this monument. And if you drive up the Bronx River Parkway, you may have glimpsed what's called the Cannon Monument. This is one of the many monuments to the Battle of White Plains. And it's facing downstream to where the main action had taken place. Okay, so the British got Chatterton Hill, whoop-de-doo. It's wonderful, and it's totally useless for launching another attack. Because it's on the wrong side of the river's flooded, you can't get wagons, artillery across it, very difficult to ford, not many known places where it's even safe to try to wade across it. So what do? Now, General Howe, he's the guy on the right. And he had a problem very similar to Washington. This is almost uncanny. That Howe's second in command was Henry Clinton. Very similar personality to Charles Lee, one of these contrarians. Like if you take the left fork, no, you really ought to take the right. You order the ravioli, so why didn't you get the spaghetti? That kind of person. No matter, like the old Groucho Marx song, whatever you say, I'm against it. Well, Howe pulled the fast one now on Henry Clinton. I think he was getting tired of, his kibitzing, so turned to him and said, okay, we got to figure out a plan of attack for tomorrow. Washington's still dug in on those high hills. You go out there, you scout the ground, and you tell me what our plan is going to be for tomorrow. Yuck, yuck, yuck. Well, this is the plan that Henry Clinton came up with. And there's a punchline to the story. But basically, his idea, there's some forces off at Chatterton Hill, occupy this low hill called Juniper Hill. Now, if you drive up the Tarrytown Road, going past the county center, well, keep your eyes on the road, but off to your left, you might notice a rocky prominence overlooking the county center. That's Juniper Hill. So he's thinking, get some troops there on Juniper Hill, get the artillery, make a mad dash across that Bronx River Bridge. It's still covered by American artillery, but the Americans hadn't burned it. So if we really go real fast, we get enough guns across the river, climb up Juniper Hill, and start a long-range bombardment, the Americans on Purdy Hill. Keep everybody occupied. In the meantime, make another feint far to the east, another try on Merritt Hill, make it look like we're serious this time, so the Americans won't move any reinforcements from that end. And then gather everybody together and up Broadway, one massive punch up the middle of the line. Now, he drew up this plan, and this is Henry Clinton. So what does Henry Clinton do? Start arguing against his own plan. I'm not making this up. He says, well, guns at Juniper Hill aren't going to do any good, and it's really kind of a waste of time. I don't know what to do. It's not a very good plan. Well, Howe just listened. Yeah. So Howe decided, forget about Juniper Hill, forget about Merritt Hill. He's going to stake everything on one big push up present-day Broadway. And this was the 30th of October. The plan was to launch this attack, end the battle on the 31st of October, Halloween. What happens? Remember I mentioned it was a wet autumn. Started raining again, real hard this time, evening of the 30th of October. Now, flintlock rifles, you can't really fire them in the rain. It's difficult even to fire them reliably in heavy humidity. And this could be argued. Now, of course, it was raining on the Americans too. They couldn't fire their guns either. So some men thought, maybe we just go in with a bayonet assault, but that was not Howe's style. He wasn't very big on bayonets. He liked firepower. So it's raining. It's okay, tell everybody just stay in your tents. We'll do it tomorrow morning instead, the 1st of November. Folks, can't get this to work all of a sudden. There we go. Now, the reason this would have worked is that arguably, and I've been all over this ground on foot, this was clearly the weakest part of the American lines. Instead of the high slopes that you've got on Purdy Hill, Chatterton Hill, Hatfield Hill, the route up Broadway is it's still an uphill climb, but it's a much, much gentler slope. About maybe less than a mile from the present day town green and White Plains. And you just had a single line of entrenchments crossing what today is North Broadway. And this is what's called the Mortar Monument. This marks the line of the Washington's entrenchments. It's a real mortar from the battle. It was dug up many years later. Eventually proved to be a British mortar that got left behind in the mud. And behind the mortar, that yellow house, by the way, was an original building from the battle. It was a tavern in those days. A very nice place, big entrenchments right next to a tavern. But if you look on the right, that depression in the ground it's a little hard to make out unless you turn your ankle when you're walking across it. That's a very faint trace of what had been the American entrenchments crossing Broadway. Clearly the weakest part of the line. And if the British could just bowl their way through here, gain possession of the road, because this is the road leading north. This is the road leading up to Fishkill. If they could gain control of this road, Washington, once again, might not have anywhere to retreat to. There was one more opportunity to destroy the American army. But what happened? Well, 1st November, the sun comes out and get all the flags together and, everybody's bayonets nice and polished, and you make a big push up Broadway, and they get to that line of entrenchments and nobody's there. Washington pulled what's going to become one of his favorite maneuvers, the Midnight Houdini Act. Once again, on the advice of Charles Lee, Washington had fortified another line of defenses on even rougher hills than the ones he was occupying, Miller Hill, Mount Misery, and Foster Hill, and linking up with Hatfield Hill. And during the rainy night of Halloween, 1776, very quietly withdrew his men into the new positions. And Howe was standing there looking at an empty entrenchment, wondering where the Americans went. Well, they followed them up the Broadway and took one look at these hills and thought, uh-oh, it's a much worse situation than we had to begin with. Now, this is a picture of Mount Misery as it looks today. And story has it this was named by the American troops who had to camp out there in the rain on the evening of October 31st, trying to cook their rations as best they could. Extremely tough, rocky, glacial wasteland, but which, believe it or not, is under threat of development today. So get a good look at this picture, maybe your last chance. But it was the highest of all the hills around White Plains. One look at that, no good line of approach to attack. So Howe decided to leave Mount Misery alone. Next door to the west was Miller Hill. And this is a picture of the top of Miller Hill as it exists today. There's a very small park and historical marker there. And once again, over on the left, if you kind of squint a little bit, you can just about make out there's a very shallow depression that marks the remnants of the American entrenchment from 1776, but only slightly shorter than Mount Misery and just as tough to climb. If you do this on foot, I'll tell you, be very, very careful. It's a very, very difficult route up there. And that's pretty much where the British were stymied. They made a half-hearted attempt to storm Miller Hill. They had no good line of approach. They took probably the least of the worst approaches from the west. And they ran into John Glover's regiment, the same guys who bollocked them up at the Battle of Pelt's Point. Only this time John Glover's got cannon, and he opens up the cannon, and the British lost about 150 casualties before they even got the attack started. So they broke it off, and essentially that was the end of the Battle of White Plains. They trade cannon shots back and forth up until the 4th of November, 1776, but essentially the 1st of November was the end of it. So who won? This is the question. Now, arguably, when the British occupied that first line of entrenchments, when they marched to Broadway, technically by 18th century standards, they could call it a victory. That's how it was decided in those days. If you advanced, occupied the original line of the enemy, you took off your hats, you hip hip huzzah, and it was a famous victory. Was it a real victory? No, far from it. The American army was perfectly intact, still functioning, still loaded for bear, and in many ways still very, very aggressive and ready to fight. The British remained there glaring at them for a while. By now, they were just totally out of ideas how to attack the Americans. Bit of good news comes to General Howe, got him out of his dilemma. A deserter from Fort Washington, troops had been left behind in northern Manhattan at Fort Washington, where today Washington Heights is, and Bennett Park, northern Manhattan. And Howe had a golden opportunity to attack and carry Fort Washington, thanks to the information he got from this deserter. So he decided, okay, that's really more important. We should really need to go back to New York and secure our winter quarters. So to heck with Washington, he's not going anywhere but further north. And the British turn around, they march west and away from the Battle of White Plains. So it makes a very odd situation. It was a battle that both sides retreated from sooner or later. But 4th of November, Howe does one of Washington's tricks, moves his army silently out in the middle of the night and surprises the Americans the next day. So calling this a British victory is very, very problematical. Although, of course, for the Americans could also claim a victory by 18th century standards. Because of the morning of 5th of November, they came down from the hills and they occupied the British line that had been there the night before. So, on technical grounds, both sides could claim a victory, although nothing much was accomplished. By now, Washington's flour train had gotten its way up to Fishkill. The food was secure. And Washington waited till the 10th of November and then finally retreated the rest of his army up the road across the Croton River into the secure bastion of Fishkill. And then from there, eventually the war would transfer to New Jersey, and you would have the great retreat down New Jersey that ended in the Battle of Trenton, where our hero, Colonel Rawl, would come to grief and get himself killed in the meantime. But that's another story. And just to wrap it up, there have been a number of very interesting attempts to commemorate the battle over the years, and I'm going to present you with a mystery. Anybody can tell me anything about this, I would really love to hear it. 100th anniversary of the battle. There was a White Plains Monument Association got together, and they were going to erect an obelisk to commemorate the battle. And on the 100th anniversary of the battle, they had a ceremonial cornerstone laying. And this is a picture of that ceremony. I can't see the cornerstone in there, but you can tell it was a very rainy, drizzly, dreary day. And what became of this cornerstone, I have no idea. I can't even tell confidently locate the exact spot. It was somewhere on today's Battle Hill. But I've been all over Battle Hill, peeking into people's backyards, hoping to see it, somebody's grill on top of it, but not a trace. I just have no idea what became of this cornerstone. But there's a lot of commemorations that go on today. And you might recognize this is the far corner of St. Paul's Churchyard in Mount Vernon. And this is a ceremony commemorating some of the men of Glover's regiment who died at the Battle of Pell's Point. And you notice this is a point I haven't brought out yet, but you notice the reenactors were lined up there. At least a third of Glover's Marble Hill Regiment were, I'll say, men of color. African descent, Indian descent, combinations of the two, but nevertheless non-white people who would save Washington's army on no less than 3 occasions because they were fishermen. You notice the garb, the short trousers and the short jackets and the sock hats. These are the guys that got them across the East River. They were the guys who fought off the British at Pell's Point and Miller Hill. And 6 weeks later, crossing the Delaware, standing up in the boat and all that, these were the guys who had the maritime skills to handle the small craft and move an army across the river. And some of these men are from an organization called the Gowanus Dredgers. I remember one of the first pictures we show everybody was retreating across Gowanus Creek, where the Gowanus Canal is. Well, these guys have regular canoe trips on the Gowanus Canal. If you feel daring, I've done it. And I'm still here to tell the tale. But once a year they have a commemorative canoe trip on the Gowanus Canal to commemorate the retreat of the Americans from the Battle of Brooklyn. That's worth keeping an eye out for. And also commemorating the battle is the Heritage Trail. It's a trail that was laid out. It's about 11 miles long, and it links various places that figured in the battle. And it's rather showing wear and tear, but you can still follow the wayfinding signs. And you can also download a copy of the map from the White Plains Historical Society. Better driven than walk. I'll just give you that piece of advice. Or if you want to climb up Battle Hill, there's a park there, Whitney Park. It's basically a great big monument to the battle. And it's loads of very, very wonderfully informative signposts there telling you all about the battle, and a grand view of White Plains stretching off to the east. And nearby, the First Presbyterian Church in White Plains is worth a visit, because that's where a lot of the participants and the civilians from the battle are buried. And this picture of the churchyard, see those clumps of American flags about the middle of the picture? They mark a mass grave of American casualties from the Battle of White Plains. The church actually has a list of the men who were buried there. It's about 200 names, all told. There's also, some family tragedies there. And a lot of civilians were caught up in the battle, and they suffered too. And this is the family of Ann Fisher Miller, the very kind hostess who got both Washington and Charles Lee in her house at the same time. Lucky her. Well, that was the least of her worries, was the broken furniture that Charles Lee would leave behind. Spring of 1776, her husband Elijah, 2 sons, Elijah Jr. and John, they all marched south with the 3rd Westchester Militia in New York City. Elijah was mortally wounded a week before the Battle of Brooklyn, literally carried home to die, and he's buried there on the end. The 2 sons went through the battle okay. They went through the Battle of White Plains, marched up to Fishkill, and actually today is the anniversary, the 21st of December, 1776. News came that they both died that same day of what was called a fever. Could be anything, typhus, typhoid, who knows, but nevertheless, they were dead. And Ann Fisher had to send a wagon up to Fishkill. She was able to retrieve their bodies, bury them in the churchyard, and continue on managing the farm with her one remaining son. One tombstone is the new one on the end. Her tombstone had been lost for many years, till a couple of local historians relocated it and got a very authentic local stonecutter to carve a 18th century style tombstone. And so she's there with her husband and two sons to this day. And also Abigail Purdy, remember her with the red house? She and Jacob were buried there. Jacob survived the battle. He served in the militia, and they both lived to, like, at the time, it was really an incredibly old age, about 93. Jacob died at the age of 91. People didn't always die as young as we think they did back in the 18th century. It was either you died very young or you died very old sometimes, but they're buried there as well. And farther afield, and not many people know about this, if you go up to Mount Pisco, there's a little churchyard immediately south of the hospital complex, where in 1776 there had been a field hospital. There was a church there, a very small church. They dropped off some of the more severely wounded as the army retreated northwards. And as so often happened in those days, they died in care, and they're buried there in the churchyard with this very modest little marker to note their passing. And even farther afield, I'll just give you one more story because this is a good one. And please ignore the work of the seagulls in this picture. But Simon Patch, now his tombstone is all the way out in Groton, Massachusetts. But it tells about he was mortally wounded at the Battle of White Plains and died 31st of December. What happened? He took a very, very severe wound at the Battle of Chatterton Hill. And he should have gone to a field hospital, but his brother was there. His brother was a corporal. And his brother knew, like, you don't go to field hospitals. That's like, that's a death sentence back then. So what Jacob Patch did, he somehow got hold of a horse. I won't imagine how he got hold of the horse, but got hold of a horse and he rigged up sort of like a Plains Indian travois, threaded a couple of saplings through the stirrups and set a bale of hay on it. And then he set Simon on the bale of hay. And together they started off 200 miles away to Groton, Massachusetts. And believe it or not, he got Simon there alive, but 31st of December, 1776, he finally died of his wounds and he's buried in the local churchyard. So I could go on all night, but that's the gist of it. And I want to thank a lot of people. Particularly, I want to thank Jorge Santiago. I forgot to mention him in relation to the Battle of Pell's Point because he clued me in to a discovery by Blake Bell, which was like the one piece of the puzzle that made everything fall into place and make sense. And I want to thank everybody in the East Bronx History Forum. I've had a lot of insights from all of you over the years. So if you want to delve into this a little more closely, there's a number of other organizations you might want to check out. The White Plains Historical Society, for starters. They have an annual commemoration of the battle every October with reenactors, and it's great fun if you don't mind climbing the hill to get up there to the Purdy House. But also the Daughters of Liberty's Legacy. They hold a number of events at the Miller House in North White Plains, along with the Friends of the Miller House, Washington's headquarters. And the Brigade of the American Revolution. This is like an umbrella organization of reenactors. If you go on their website, they've got a calendar, which every year will tell you just where they're having reenacting events all across the country. Excuse me, and the Eastchester Historical Society, which keeps a lot of the records. And of course, there's some dude wrote a book about it too. Check that out as well. You can get the book from, you can get it through the usual channels, but I would recommend going to the History Press website. Because when you do, you're going to find a ton of other books you're going to want to look at as well. Or Bronx River Books in Scarsdale also has a website you can order from them, or Wormrath's Books in Bronxville. So anyway, if there's any questions, what time we have, I'll be happy to attempt to answer them. I know I just barely scratched the surface on this subject, but there's a lot more to be said.
Question, Steve, and this is Rich here. It seems that General Clinton was kind of, was that his nature, just to be very like just second guess himself, or just to be contrary, or?
Yeah, total contrarian. Yeah, just even to the point of contradicting himself sometimes.
Right.
He was a very, very odd duck. I don't want to, try to, diagnose him, but he may have been high functioning autistic or something. He had a very extremely socially awkward personality, as did Charles Lee. I mean, it would have been fun to get the two of them together in the same room, on the same side, but that didn't happen. Clinton's good luck or bad luck is he eventually got to be commander in chief. Howe was recalled to London, 1778, and they made Clinton commander in chief. Graduations is what he always wanted. And by the way, we want you to detach 5,000 troops, send them to the Caribbean because we've got a world war going on now. The French have entered the conflict. So poor Henry Clinton, he finally got what he always wanted, and he didn't have the troops to do it with. That's another story. Reading his memoirs is fun. I'll just say that.
Do we know about his demise, or what was his final windup, so to speak, after all?
Well, he survived the war, and he retired, and he had the time to write his memoirs. And of course, according to his memoirs, if they'd only listened to him in the first place, the war would have been won, and none of this would have happened, et cetera, et cetera. Typical memoir autobiography sort of stuff.
Well, Stephen, the cannon that was on the Bronx River Parkway down from the county center, you made the first turn. Used to be right there. Is that the one that disappeared, or was that moved?
No, it disappeared twice.
Twice.
Yeah, originally it was a cannon that was found on the battlefield. It may have been one of the Alex Hamilton's own guns. We don't know, but it was dug up on the field. And let's see, in 1971, I think it was stolen. The cops recovered it. They put it back on the monument. Then a few years later, it was stolen again, and this time for good. So what you're looking at now is a reproduction. About 10 years later, they came up with a reproduction, and that's the best they can do.
And that was the first cannon that you showed us, correct? The mortar monument, or that was the cannon monument?
No, that's the cannon monument.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, the one in the picture is the replacement cannon.
And did both of those monuments go up around the same time, or do you know, or?
Just about 1926 for the quincentennial, the 150th anniversary.
Right.
Sesquicentennial, sorry, I'm losing my vocabulary here.
I think Eric Bell raised his hand, has a question.
Yeah, actually, a comment on something you said, Stephen. I actually live in Miller Hill, or on top of Miller Hill, and as far as I know, I believe the town of North Castle has just purchased or entered in an agreement to purchase Mount Misery and make that part of their open space parkland. The section that you said that was in threat of development.
But I know it was under discussion, but that was about the last I heard. And
I believe they just voted on it last week. I'm just double
great.
checking. I was reading the Examiner. I think it's might not be a done deal, but that's
okay. Well, that's
happening.
Okay, well, that's good news. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
I have a question about Colonel Glover.
Hmm.
I was always fascinated by Glover's rock outside of Orchard Beach in Pelham Bay. And so I did a little research on him. Weren't his men disdained by the rest of the troops in Washington's army?
To an extent.
Because of their backgrounds.
Yeah, to an extent. And Washington himself, well, he was a Virginian. And, he came up to Massachusetts, and here's this unit. It's like maybe a third, we can't be exactly sure, but probably about a third of them being men of color, if not half. And he was very, very uneasy about this. They didn't want, recruit slaves or men of color into the Continental Army. But, Glover stood his ground on that, says, look, here we are. You want us to serve or not, and so, and luckily, Washington backed down. He accepted them because they would go on to literally save the revolution on at least 3 occasions because they had these maritime skills, which not Washington or anybody else in the army had. So, and they were extremely a very tough unit too, because they were fishermen. This is the key. They were Grand Banks fishermen. The British had blockaded the Grand Banks, so they enlisted the army. They're unemployed. But being fishermen, this is then as now is one of the most hazardous occupations you can engage in. So these were tough men. They knew how to work as a team. They knew how to look after each other, and they knew how to follow orders. And luckily, their colonel was also a seaman too. He was a merchant ship captain, John Glover. So this made them into what you think would be very, very strange material for an infantry regiment, into a very, very effective, one of the best units in Washington's army at this time.
And there were also some indigenous people in his army. Do you know
Yeah.
what tribes?
Well, it was the
This wasn't
I
Wampanoag.
almost said
I know the Wampanoags were around the Plymouth area. I'm not familiar with further north up
Yeah.
in Marquette.
no Stockbridge. I was trying to say. You had an organ. Well,
I think it
you
might
had a
have been.
group of people living around Stockbridge, Massachusetts. A lot of them had been Muncie people living in the Hudson River Valley. They'd converted to Christianity a long time ago. They were living in this literally like a Christian settlement, Christian missionary settlement at Stockbridge, which was run by Presbyterians, and Presbyterians were really hardline pro-patriot people. So they were very much, full of the patriot side of the conflict. And a group of them, they had all the hunting and woodcraft skills. And a group of them showed up at the siege of Boston. Okay, here we are. We're Americans too. We're here to join the fight. And again, they had a lot of odd looks, but they were eventually accepted into the army. And they served Washington as scouts because they had these great woodcraft skills. And they would come to grief 2 years later, 1778, which be included in my next book. But yeah, you had women, you had Native Americans, you had African Americans. The revolution was a much more diverse story than we realize.
Stephen, we have an online question from Mike Virgentino. He's asking, where is the stone wall you mentioned along Fenimore Road?
Yeah, let me think. I'll give you a marker. It's about halfway, maybe about 300 yards east of the post road.
Another question, if anyone has any other questions. Simon Patch, interesting story.
Yeah.
I guess he was native of the New York colony, and were there any attempts to try and disinter his body from Massachusetts and to bring it back to New York State, if anything? After
No. He was a Massachusetts man.
Okay.
Yeah, there were Massachusetts units in Washington's army.
Okay.
Yeah, I found him doing research. I believe in casting a very wide net. Doing research, and with the internet, you can really cast wide net. And I found the story of all places at Find the Grave. I was just doing a broad search of White Plains Battle of, and this turned up, and like, wow, I never would have imagined it. It tells you how tough people were in those days too.
Sure. And the modes of transportation, of course, were not what they are today. Warfare was definitely different. It was far difficult to do.
Yeah.
And they didn't have the luxuries that we have today in terms of, mechanization of things. So.
No, they didn't have much food either, or, clothing, or, particularly the American side. There was short of just about anything you could imagine.
Exactly. And like you said, it was fought over flour. He was looking for flour. It was basic, if you have flour, you can make bread, and that would sustain you at best. So,
Yeah, that was about it. You'd sit around the campfire, you'd issued like loose flour. That was your ration. So what can you do? Well, like you'd add some water to it, you'd make like a gooey paste, and maybe you could cook it on a flat rock, or maybe you could form it around the end of a ramrod and, kind of like cook it like marshmallows. Pretty disgusting, but it was nutrition of the sort.
something's better than nothing, I guess. Right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I had another question.
Mhm.
I've asked this at other history presentations with East Bronx and also with the St. Paul's Church. I'm still curious to find out whether or not George Washington fled at any point along the Bronx River to get up to White Plains. So at one venue, someone said probably on Old Army Road, that was the closest he got to the Bronx River. Do you know, Stephen?
Yeah. Old Army Road was part of the American route to White Plains. Now, Washington's exact line of march, I'm sure he saw the Bronx River on more than one occasion, because he was very much a frontline commander. But certainly Old Army Road, or bits and pieces of it, or do trace the route that the Army followed from Valentine's Hill and Yonkers up to White Plains. And by the way, to Washington, Washington never heard of the Bronx River. It was the Bronx River, Brunks, on all the maps. Just a little bit of trivia, in case that comes up on Jeopardy sometime.
Okay, so does any?
I should mention that Washington was a lot closer to the Bronx River in 1780. Now, eventually, everything came around full circle. They reoccupied central Westchester. In the spring of 1780, the French are coming in, and Washington is desperate. He wants to find a way to bash his way back into New York City. This was an obsession of his. He wanted to retake New York. So they held what was called the Grand Reconnaissance. And they rode all up and down the Bronx River. They were scouting out the British defenses, looking for some way they could get across the Harlem River. And he definitely rode down what today is the West Farms Road, from West Farms, literally right on the banks of the river. Turned out he didn't find a good route back to New York City and went to Yorktown instead. But just thought I'd mention that. He'd been in the river more than once.
Stephen, when you mention Yorktown, that's Yorktown, New York, not
Oh,
York.
no, I'm sorry. I meant Yorktown, Virginia.
Virginia, all right.
Yeah, that was 1780. That was his obsession. He was positive he wanted to bash his way into New York, and it was really Rochambeau. After they had scouted all the possible lines of approach, Rochambeau kind of tapped him on the shoulder to look, I just heard something, Cornwallis is in a spot of bother down in Yorktown. If we could march down there, we can bag him. So that's what turned the whole war around. The British would occupy New York City literally the last day of the war. It'll be the last piece of the United States they would occupy.
So your books, as you said, is available at Walmart's in Bronxville, I guess, online at Barnes and Noble, and also Amazon. Any other places?
Oh, sure. Yeah, certainly. Bronx River Books in Scarsdale. They got a very good mail online service. And also, again, I would say the History Press. Google the History Press / Arcadia Books. And they've got a very good online ordering service. And they've got oodles of local history books. So you'll just have fun shopping, looking around. But buy my book first, please.
We have
They were really, really great fun. I can't recommend this publisher enough. They've been very good to me, by the way. But they've literally got a couple of hundred of what are called hyper local books, and there's about 200 just for the state of New York alone. So it's you'll have fun looking around.
Before we go, we have another comment from Mike Virgentino. Says George Washington, Rochambeau were even on what is today the campus of Fordham University during this search for a route to Manhattan. So any comment on that or?
Yeah, that was the courts of Farm, and one of Washington's scouts was a very young fellow by the name of Andrew Corson. And yeah, they came down there. They hooked up with Andrew, and he knew all the terrain south of there. So basically, he led them down along the Bronx River and across, into West Farms and thereabouts. He knew where to ride, where the roads were, and where the trails were. Sadly, I don't think there's a monument to him anywhere. But basically, more or less, the footprint of Fordham University today approximates the footprint of the course of Farm.
Okay, was he the spy in James Fenimore Cooper's novel?
No, that was well, again, this is controversial, but it's most generally accepted there was a man called Enoch Crosby.
Crosby.
A very real person. He's buried up in Yorktown, New York. And he wrote a book after The Spy came out. He wrote a book. He outed himself as, I'm the guy who's the spy. Harvey Birch was the fictitious spy, and Crosby claimed that he was the model for him. There's actually somebody buried in St. Peter's churchyard. John Honeywell, I believe, who's also been advanced as the model for Harvey Birch. We'll never know for sure. We don't have the documentation one way or the other. Cooper got all the stuff from stories that were told to him by John Jay.
Okay.
And John Jay, being a very good spy master, he kept the details quiet. He didn't drop no names, so it could be Crosby, it could be Honeywell, it could be who knows.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Stephen.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, bang up job, Stephen. Very good.
Oh, thank you.
And everybody just have a great holiday season. Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, everything else. Happy holidays, Happy New Year. And we'll see.
Dorothy raised her hand.
Yes, Dorothy.
Unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself, Dorothy. Unmute yourself, Dorothy.
I was trying to just wave and give you the thumbs up.
Oh, okay, thank you. I just got a little message there. Dorothy raised hand.
I don't know how to play with all the buttons yet.
Okay, well, thanks for waving.
Okay, take care and have a good holiday, everybody.
Yes, happy holidays. Thanks again, Stephen. And
Okay, thanks again, Rich, and everybody else. And I wish everybody the happiest and safest holiday season.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye now.